Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric and our continuing series on a technicality where I answer some of the more technical questions you guys have. And something that I hear in the comments all the time on all of my modification and repair videos is, I would love to learn how to do that, I just can't solder. And I'm here to show you some tips and tricks on how to learn how to do it. So I'm going to tell you right now may sound surprising and even unbelievable, but it is true. Soldering is not difficult at all. Learning how to do it is one of the easiest things you can do. I know it seems intimidating, but trust me, it's not. Before you get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down there as well. But I was intimidated about soldering too when I first learned how to do it. But what I can tell you is, once you actually start, learning is quick. Now you have a couple options when you decide to do it. You can buy what I like to call a fire stick. It is a cheap $15 soldering iron. It gets the job done okay. But if you're planning on doing this for the long term, I recommend something like this Weller here. It's $120, but it comes with the stand, which is quite stable. So honestly, if you think you're going to learn to solder and you're going to do it frequently, I recommend actually spending a little bit more money off the top, because the stand this thing comes with is incredible. You need to buy the stand separately for that soldering iron you see on the right, and it's $10 and it's terrible, so you're already about 20% of the way to a good soldering iron with those crappy parts. But taking a look here, a couple other accessories you'll need. This is just a wire braid cleaner basically. It's like a Brillo pad. You have a solder sucker. You can use a hot air rework station, but that's going to be more advanced stuff. You need your solder, of course, and then a pair of side cutters are going to be useful as well, and some solder braid. That just wicks solder away where you don't want it to be. And I'll show you guys how all of these things work in just a moment, but these are kind of the basic tools I recommend when you're first getting into soldering. But I should make a note about solder in and of itself. This is made of lead, and most of the time you're going to want to be using leaded solder. Lead will kill you. It can cause cancer. Make sure you're wearing a mask when you're doing this inside in a well-ventilated area. Don't just breathe the solder fumes. It's lead. Is a few times going to hurt you? I don't know. Just don't do it. But moving on, when you take a look at a soldering iron, there's just a few parts. There's the handle, and then there's the tip. The tip is what gets hot for soldering, and there are so many options. My recommendation is the tip that comes with the iron is going to be the tip you're going to use 90% of the time. And there are so many different tips you can get. One that I do recommend that I like is a basic chisel tip. This allows you to do drag soldering, and I will show you guys how to do that in a future video if you like this first one. What I love about this Weller is that it has interchangeable tips, and it has a plastic handle so that you can change the tips while the iron's hot. You do need to be careful, but you'll see here in real time, changing a tip out takes no more than 5 seconds. Unscrew it, change the tip, screw it back in, and you're ready to work with an entirely different type of tool. And as you get more involved, you're going to start buying more tips for more uses. But for today's video, we're just going to show you the basic pencil tip. The one other thing you're going to want is solder wick, because you are going to make mistakes. Solder wick's going to fix all of those mistakes for you. It is copper. Solder loves going to copper. If you put this wick over solder and you heat it up with your iron, it is going to absorb into that wick. Because, for lack of a better term, solder works with surface tension. And if you've ever seen anybody pour water into a cup, and I go slightly over so don't judge me, you can get water over the rim of a glass because the molecules are held together with surface tension. That water doesn't want to spill over. And solder is very similar. It wants to go to metal, to copper, and it doesn't want to go anywhere else. What I recommend is just grab a prototype breadboard. This is what I learned how to solder on years ago, and you can't screw anything up because it doesn't do anything. Don't try your first project on a game console. Don't try your first project on something you care about. Get a breadboard and just start soldering to it, because if you make a mistake, who cares? These things are like $2 and they don't functionally do anything. But you'll see here as I turn the soldering station on, this is why I recommend something more in the $100 range. It heats up incredibly fast. That $15, $20 fire stick soldering iron takes about 5 minutes to heat up, or something like this Weller has microcontrols for the temperature, and it'll come up to temperature in about 60 seconds. So when you're actually soldering a lot, this makes a huge difference. And you'll see here as I've sped that up about 20 seconds, it is now to temp. Now this is a warning. Obviously this is hot, it's 340 degrees Celsius. If you touch this to your skin, you are going to burn yourself. And you're going to know you did it for 2 reasons. 1, you're going to feel pain, and 2, and I know this sounds gross, you're going to smell roast pork. That's just the reality of it. If you burn your finger with a soldering iron, it smells like roast pork chops. Don't know why, I guess that's just what humans smell like. But my point is, it's hot, be careful with it. You will burn yourself, but you'll only make that mistake once or twice and you can't do it too bad. But you'll see here, to melt solder, all you're doing is touching the solder to the tip, and it melts. And I'm putting on way too much here, but I'm just showing you how quick it is. And you'll see that that solder is going to basically sit on the tip. I'm using the chisel tip right now, but that's all it takes to melt solder. And you'll see here on this project mat, I can wipe it off, but the solder doesn't really want to go there because it isn't a metal. To get all this solder off of the tip and just to clean your tip, we'll come in with our little Brillo pad here and we'll just push the soldering iron tip in and out to get most of the solder off. You'll also have a sponge with you. You want it to be moist, but you don't want it to be dripping. And this just allows you to drag the tip of the soldering iron through that sponge to remove that additional solder that you don't need on there. Keep your tips clean, and they're going to serve you well for a long time. Just don't drag too aggressively, because sometimes the solder will want to shoot back at you. It's rare, but it does happen. But taking a look right here at the iron, we can change the tips out on something like the Weller, where that fire stick, you need to let it cool down and before you can change the tip because the screw mount is made of metal. This is at 340 degrees Celsius right now, and you'll see if I just take that tip off, I need to use tweezers. Don't forget the tip is hot, so just use a pair of nice tweezers and you can pop the tip out, put it on your project mat, and this silicone will not melt. And then don't forget, the heat is still there. Do not put the tip on with your fingers. Grab the second tip, the one you want to replace, with your tweezers, line it up and pop it right in the hole here. And then we'll just come in and put on that clasp. And you'll see I get my hand a little close to it, and it's slightly warm, doesn't burn, but your body's going to know when to pull away. We screw that down, it starts to heat back up, and within about 20 seconds we're using a brand new tip, which I do love how quick you can change these out. The only other thing I recommend is a pair of helping hands, because obviously if we're holding the solder with our non-dominant hand and the soldering iron with our dominant hand, we need something to actually hold the board. And what I recommend is keep the soldering stand on your non-dominant hand side so you're not moving your hand to the right where it's held. I've knocked the soldering iron a few times. And we're going to get a better close-up soon, but all you do with these little through holes is you put your iron on the area you want to solder, you advance the solder in, it melts, and that is all there is to soldering. The metal is going to want to go to the hole. There's copper around it. Everywhere where there's not is called solder mask, and these helping hands can be a little bit of a pain, so definitely tighten them down. And that's as simple as it is. We've just put solder in these through holes. It's as simple as that. And I can't stress this enough, the solder does not want to sit on the solder mask. It will not. That's why it's called a mask. And once you get quick at this, you can just go down the line and solder in components like on this little micro USB for the Mister, the Damon Bite adapter. It's really easy. And if you get a bridge, you can just rub it right out, and I'll show you to do that in a second. But say you want to do something like install a capacitor. This is just through hole soldering. It's kind of going to be where you start. You're not going to be dealing with surface mount components when you're learning to do this, and I will show you guys in a future video how to deal with surface mount if you want. But say you just want to pop a capacitor in, you're just going to push the legs through the holes, and then you're going to turn the board around and kind of get the capacitor as close to the board as you need. Now if you wanted to bend it over, you'd leave yourself a little bit more material, but just go ahead and get that capacitor close, and then you'll use the legs as its own retention system. Just bend them out ever so slightly, and that's going to put enough tension on that cap through the board that if we turn it over, it's not going to fall out. We can now solder to that at our leisure, and we don't have to worry about it. You're always going to want to be smart about how you're dealing with gravity, because when you're working with the helping hands, if things aren't retained well, they're just going to fall out, and we can't solder things that aren't actually through the board. So just figure out whatever angle works for you and get your soldering iron ready. And now you'll see we've gotten a lot closer and how easy this is. We're just going to put the soldering iron on to that through hole, and we're going to advance the solder in. Don't use too much, don't use too little. Less is more, you can always add. And you'll see there now we have that one component soldered in. This is quite hard for me to do because I'm doing it over the camera, so I'm doing it at weird angles. Use whatever angle works for you. But you'll see now we've soldered that capacitor in through those through holes, and it is ready to do whatever it would be doing. In this instance, obviously nothing, because this is just a breadboard. I'm not building anything. And once you get that soldered in, you don't want those legs sticking out. So just come in with your side cutters and snip near the top. Hold the leg or whatever you're cutting with your finger, because they do love to shoot around everywhere. But you'll see here we have two solder joints. There's not too much solder on them, there's not too little, and they are not bridged. It is very difficult to get bridge on through hole components, but it can happen, and I'll show you how to deal with that in a moment. But say you want to get this out. What I recommend is you can use the solder pump, but if you just heat up the solder and ever so lightly pull on those capacitors, Don't pull too hard, just kind of wiggle it back and forth while you maintain the heat on that solder and it is molten. Eventually it'll pop right out. We haven't ripped out the via, which is the copper plating inside of that hole, and we're good to go. You want to get the solder out, just use your solder wick, that little braid right there, and just go ahead and put it on top of the pad and apply heat. Don't wiggle it back and forth, just let that heat sink in and it's going to go to the braid. If you remove the heat, you can totally solder the braid to the board. That's fine. Just keep applying heat. Use your soldering tip kind of to move that off to the side and it'll pop right out and you'll see we've got most of the solder. It's really hard to get everything with that braid. So what we'll do is we'll come in, we'll just heat up that pad and we'll use our solder sucker, push the pump down, push the button, and that hole is now clear. Sometimes it takes a few times, but you will get there. But let's say you want to do something like just screw up intentionally. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop some solder into these through holes here, and I'm going to do it pretty haphazardly. You'll see that if I try to put the solder on the mask, it does not want to go there. But the minute I drag that solder ball on the tip over those copper vias, it's going to want to sit. We've created a bridge. Add more solder, move your soldering iron back and forth, and surface tension is going to deal with that for you. The bridge rectified itself and now we have solder in both of those holes. If I add way too much, you're going to see it's still really hard to get a bridge. And we have massive amounts of solder there. Just heat your tip up, move it back and forth, and you're going to see that that solder sits in those holes. If you have a bridge, just use your iron, move it back and forth, and that bridge will clear. And when you're done, you're going to see there's a little bit of solder mask, that resin right there, that's in the core, that's flux. We can use external flux in a tube as well, but for this instance, I'm not teaching you how to do that. But just make sure you clean it up with an isopropyl alcohol, rubbed toothbrush, or Q-tip, just to keep it clean. But let's say we always want to put a basic wire into one through hole. We need a jumper wire. A lot of times I will just let gravity and wire do the work for me. You don't always need a helping hand. You'll pop that wire through the hole and just go ahead and bend the wire and get that board to sit up on its own. It takes a second. You may need to change the configuration, but it will eventually, like you see here, sit. Just advance the soldering iron in, move your solder towards that hole, and you're going to go ahead and solder that wire directly into that through hole, and it is going to be secure. If you take a look at it from the other side, and I'll turn it around in just a second, that wire is exactly where we need it to be. If you want to remove the wire, it's even easier. Just go ahead and isolate it, and just pull on it ever so slightly. Put a little bit of tension on that wire, use your fingers to hold the board, apply heat to the solder that you already have on there, and it'll pop right out, no big deal. These are just the basics of soldering. This is not a full tutorial. This is to get you in the mood to start. Because what I will tell you is it seems daunting and it is not. It's one of the easiest skills you can learn. And when you get good at it, the amount of things you can do with it are incredible. I've modified so many things with soldering. If you have any questions or comments, so leave them down below. If you want me to continue this series and show you more intermediate and advanced soldering, I'm happy to. Short of that, if you could do me a huge favor, go down below and hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps me out. I'll have more videos in this technicality series, and I'll have videos on other topics throughout the week. But definitely, guys, if you want to learn how to solder, just do it. It's not that bad. See you next time. Bye-bye.